Almost exactly 2 months ago, a 19-year-old former student drove up to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, got out of his car with an AR-15 and a bag containing another 8 30-round magazines, walked into the school and started shooting. 6.5 minutes later, there were 17 people dead and 14 more wounded. Then he just faded away in the crowd of students stampeding away from the school. I probably didn't need to tell you about that because it was such a story in the news for days and days, and most of you probably know most of the details of it. But did you know this one? A day earlier in Memphis, a 15-year-old walked into his school and into a PE class, first period PE class, where there were about 75 students. He walked up to a 17-year-old senior, pulled a gun out of the band of his sweatpants and shot the other kid 3 times in the head. Then he turned to his teacher, handed him the gun, and said, "Well, I took care of that." You probably didn't hear that story, did you?
No.
The reason is it doesn't have the impact that the first one has, obviously. But you may be surprised to know that this so-called epidemic of school shootings, the second story I told you, is actually 4 times more common than the first one of those. What I'm going to be explaining tonight is that there is no such thing as an epidemic of school shootings going on right now. And we are in danger of spending hundreds of millions of dollars to solve a problem that does not exist. The real issue is that we have 2 things going on in our brains revolving around this story of school shootings. One of them is something called the clustering illusion. Our minds are set up so that we recognize patterns really easily. And when we see events that look similar to one another, we assume that there's a pattern involved in that, whether there is or not. That, unfortunately, corresponds well to the second cognitive bias called confirmation bias, as you all know. Confirmation bias is the phenomenon where we tend to pay more attention to stories and statistics and whatnot that support what we already believe than to just neutral data. When you put those 2 things together, when something scary like these school shootings happens, you can come to the wrong conclusion, and that's what we've done. A few numbers I think might be enlightening. You've probably seen those statistics that some of them claim that there have been 300 or 400 school shootings since the early 1990s. That's not true. The definition of a school shooting that's used to get those high numbers involves any time a gun goes off on school property, any time of the day or night, any day of the year. So for example, if some gangbangers shoot it out on a playground in Chicago, that's classified as a school shooting for that purpose, even though it's clearly not. If you look at just shootings that take place during school hours involving students, teachers, parents, other adults who should be in the school, there have been just 22 of them since 1990 where more than 1 person died. That isn't anywhere close to an epidemic. It's not a good thing when anyone gets killed anywhere, obviously, but you're talking here, what, 22 and 340 some odd months would be roughly 1 death every 2 or 3 months. The total number of people killed since 1990 in school shootings is 130 nationwide, another 250 wounded. But you have to remember, at any given time, there are almost 6 million high school students alone in 17,000 schools. And so that you have to keep those numbers in perspective. About 75% of all school shootings are what are called targeted shootings. In other words, the kid with the gun or the adult with the gun wants to kill a specific person and does it. It's usually somebody, there's been a fight or a broken romance or something like that that triggers the events. The stereotype that we have of the sinister guy coming into the school with the AR-15 are so rare they're almost like unicorns. And there are very few of those. In fact, 5 since 1990. The average age of a school shooter is 16. Males outnumber females 17 to 1 in school shootings, and not one single school shooter, or with one exception, not one single school shooter has been a former mental patient diagnosed with a recognizable problem, like say schizophrenia or paranoia or something. The one exception was that guy who shot up the elementary school in Connecticut a few years ago. Now, the problem is everybody has panicked over this, and they're talking about doing some very expensive things that will not work. For example, one of the most common ones I hear about is the idea that each school should have a single entry point, and there should be one of those airport screening gizmos, you know, the thing you walk through, the metal detector and the conveyor belt that you put your bag on. Well, those little gizmos cost $400,000 each. There are 17,000 high schools alone in the United States with 6 million kids who would have to walk through those machines every single morning. If you've ever gone through one of them in an airport, picture 6 million people trying to go through that machine. You should go maybe to Eastmont or Wenatchee High School some morning and watch the kids trying to go in the door, and imagine them trying to get through that security checkpoint in less than, say, 2 or 3 or 4 hours, maybe, if you were lucky. And that's because kids carry all sorts of stuff in those bags and backpacks. I've seen dog clippers, cooking utensils, everything you can imagine. You hear a lot that we need to improve mental health services. That's an extremely expensive prospect, and no, we don't. As I pointed out, only one of the school shooters who's engaged in that since 1990 has been diagnosed with a mental illness. Finally, you hear the idea that there should be more armed guards or maybe even armed teachers. Give a thought to some of the teachers you've had somewhere along the line. Picture them with a gun at school. That scares the crap out of me, and I was one of them. I'd probably be in prison if I had had a gun back when I was teaching. But in any event, the idea is not practical. The average school shooting lasts less than 30 seconds. It's like that kid in Memphis. So what that means is that your pistol-packing French teacher had better be standing right next to the guy who's going to run amok, or there's not a chance that that person can get off the shooting. Also, introducing guns to a school brings its own set of dangers. What happens if somebody loses one, or gets it taken out of a file cabinet or whatever it might be? Very poor idea. In 4 of the 5 biggest casualty school shootings, there were armed security guards on the premises when the shooting took place, and they could not prevent it. The bottom line here is that people are rushing to solve a problem that doesn't actually exist. Now, I'm not saying it's okay that kids are getting shot at school. It's definitely not okay. But it does not require the kind of response that we are hearing about over and over and over. I don't know.